Well, what I did is on this one, there is, let's see here, there's one that kind of stood out to me. Why don't we do two things? We'll maybe skip the First Peter thing here. We'll see, we'll skip one of them. But you see this little portion, this intro on Acts at the top. If one of you would be maybe willing, or if you don't, I'll read it. But read it, and then there's a couple, some of these that might be interesting for a little discussion. Anybody interested?
I would be very interested, because I still had some questions from Acts from last time.
Oh, okay.
I read Stephen's story, like on the one hand you get caught up in this martyr narrative, on the other hand I'm like, the whole interfaith dialogue thing, some of your practices don't quite align with modern expectations. You're like, you're all wrong, and this is why, and I'm right. It's kind of, I don't know. I find it interesting.
Well, do you want me to just read this intro, or did you say you would?
No, I can do it.
Okay, well, thank you.
You mean the...
Yes, just those two paragraphs.
Okay. Today's passage from the Acts of the Apostles opens with Stephen, who was previously said to have an angelic or transfigured face, from Acts 6:15, gazing into heaven and having a vision of Jesus standing at the right hand of God. He voiced his vision to those around him. Stephen was steadfast in his faith in Jesus as the righteous one. Stephen had done great wonders and signs among the people, and in his steadfastness he found himself in opposition to the religious establishment, who might have felt they were playing a game of whack-a-mole with the apostles.
It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Yeah.
You don't really expect it to. Anyway, okay. Much as later Christians defined heresies and what was orthodox and what was not, the Sanhedrin was struggling with this group of Jewish heretics. Christians did not exist yet. Gamaliel, a Pharisee on the council, advised leaving the apostles alone. If they are not of God, he said, their preaching will run its course and die out. If they are of God, perhaps the council should be taking notice. It was in Acts 5:34-39. But tensions were clearly running high, and Stephen was killed. He is considered to be the first Christian martyr. His last words echo those of Jesus' words during his passion in Luke 23:34-46. He followed Jesus to the end of his life.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
How do we know that Stephen had done a lot of wonders and signs?
It's a reference in there. Let's see where. Well, it was not read today, but gosh, of course I didn't bring my Bible with me. We have one, I think, here.
But it is in the Bible?
Yes, it's in Acts. It mentions that Stephen had done these things and, kind of among the people, and that was already kind of got them stirred up. So that already kind of got them stirred up that he was doing these things. Kind of like, when Paul or Peter and they went and healed somebody or something else and the town got all upset and, oh, thank you. And they put them into jail. For some reason, whenever people do those things around there, and it throws the balance. Well, I mean, they did the same thing to Jesus,
And Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. I don't know if there are any specifics. But...
Yeah, they don't give now they tell you that he did, but they don't say all what they were. I think it's kind of like, well, we'll talk about Jesus, but this guy, he did these things. We're just letting you know. It's kind of like a input. Yeah. And, it's, this whole passage, it's moving. You see Stephen as this kind of martyr, and, but I think one of the powerful things is, it said right before he died, he said, do not hold this sin against them. Mm-hmm. That's kind of echoing Jesus' words too about, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. So it's interesting, in the face of violence and persecution, the response is actually love and forgiveness.
I have trouble thinking about the Crusades.
Yeah.
When this is, we're going over this, and where somebody's clearly following Jesus' example, and humans are humans, and people who want to have a campaign of stealing from the heathens are going to have their campaign of stealing from the heathens if they want to. But it just kind of makes you sad that this glorious example that is being followed here, that there's such big holes in Christian history where people were using Christianity to define who it was legitimate to act with violence against and who not to forgive, instead of saying that it doesn't matter if we have these disagreements, that that we need to be living in love with each other, even people that we don't get along with.
Yeah, well, you've led us right to the question I could have, the second one down there. How can this passage inform your own actions when you become angry, when someone challenges your core beliefs? What are some alternatives to the immediate reaction that is sparked in you? Now, and I will say, people think that, priests should always we just have this thing, all of a sudden, something when they ordain us comes in and you're just always patient and kind and everything. It's not true. and there's times, where, example I can think of where I've been like at General Convention and we're in conflict about something that is very personal also. And it's painful, and you hear people getting them, and they're talking about what they think is an issue. But what it is people, because I'm like, I'm your issue over here. They can get that, and then when they use such strong terms like that, my immediate reaction is, if we're honest, is anger. I feel like insulted and hurt. And I think that's even more, like for me, I'll give an example is, for me, I can deal with anger and all these things. It's when you hurt, that thing that really just gets at you and the knife goes deeper, that I feel hurt, is when I have to do everything I can not to lash out. It's when I'm pushed to that. And that's, I'd say, especially in my personal life. But, I've kind of learned one of the things that I changed is I remember going to these general conventions every year. Have y'all heard of the Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas? That's
their funding model of winning First Amendment rights cases.
They're the ones who would picket soldiers' funerals and say they're going to hell and all that kind of, and they picket everybody. And churches, they love to try to verbally abuse, and they're very abusive in their language and stuff. Well, for about 2 or 3 general conventions in a row, they would come out and have a group of about 15 to 20 people with all their signs, some that you would not want to repeat what it says on it and stuff. And then they had those signs, and then as we would be walking in, they stationed themselves by the main entrance. They would, like there was a woman clergy walking with me, and they got out and said, "You're a whore, you're a false priest, you're an apostle of Satan, la, 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 la." All your homosexuals are going to burn forever and gnashing of teeth, and And I remember the first time, I let it get to me. The first time I heard that, and I was like, okay, I'll just get it. And I sit and talked with a friend, and I reflected, and I said, wait a minute, I know that's not the way I need to deal with this. And what was amazing was when I was faced with that again, there were some people that had never experienced, as a lot of white middle-class Episcopalians, we don't get a lot of anger kind of towards us, we're not used to that. Well, I had this one lady from Texas. Her and I didn't agree on a lot of issues, but she was wonderful. And I love this. She was a sheep rancher down in southern Texas. She was tough, but she had never faced any of that. And she was shaking and tears running down. And I kind of grabbed her and I said, listen, we're here as the body of Christ. Realize must be so hurting for all that anger and fear and wrath that invades them. And I said, the thing is, if you really, really kind of want to get their goat, completely ignore them as if they're not even there, because they want your attention to engage for a fight. And I said, that's what they want. They want you to go blah, 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 so they can go blah, 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 blah. It's a, let's get in a tit for tat yelling match. And they thrive on that. And I said, don't give them that energy of hate. Don't give into it. And it got to where after a while, when people were coming by and people would come and bring them coffee, and like, hey, how's it going? I've been in the sun a while here. I got some extra Cokes. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oh. And I'm like, yeah, they'll take our Cokes, or we're going to hell, but they'll take
Yeah.
So, and it was really interesting. The third day, they were kind of standing there, but they were just kind of like, they weren't yelling anymore, because we just weren't yelling back.
Not engaging.
And they were kind of like, and in fact, they were supposed to stay there for 7 days. After the third day, they just left. They were bored.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now I know, sorry, that's a long story, but that's kind of one example of something that it was amazingly freeing, but it didn't happen easy, but I had to work on it.
Mm-hmm.
But to let go and not lash out, it's hard. I don't know. So I don't know, any of y'all have any experiences?
I find it most hurtful when it's relatives.
Oh, yes. That really,
And so disdainful and so insulting and just like,
I've had to come to terms with a large majority of my extended family doesn't speak to me. And we were, years and years, we were close, very close. And it's hard because after losing, my mother, my father, and my two brothers, I'm the only one left in that, and I would really love to have that family connection. So that's hard, isn't it? And of course, I have one cousin who likes to post very inflammatory things that I know it's a passive aggressive jab at me when he posts it, because I'm going, and I'm like, and I just don't even reply to him or whatever. And but like the other day, he had his birthday and they had something with the grandkids, and I said, this is so wonderful. I can tell you love your grandchildren so much. They're blessed to have a grandfather that loves them. And he doesn't know what to do with this. And his wife, I think she will go in and on that when I'll say something about, I'm so glad y'all were doing well and stuff. And she'll say, thank you, this is so kind. So, yeah, it's...
I have a nephew that's kind of the same way. He doesn't know what church I go to now. He just knows I don't go to the Mormon church anymore. And so every time I see him, he makes a jabby comment about different churches, like each time. We were all together. He goes, oh, do you know the Catholic Church up until 1960? It was their, what's the word I'm looking for? And they thought that the world was flat.
That's
And
completely wrong.
he just thinks, I don't know where he gets this stuff, because
The same place on the internet that my brother gets his. Wherever it comes from, but yeah.
and I just kind of sit there and if that's how you have to be, whatever.
I got to the point where my only response is, I'm sorry you feel that way.
There was an instant, I can't remember how many years ago it was now, where my father liked something on Facebook, some post about how people who had left the Mormon church were, I can't remember the exact details, but the gist of it was under the influence of Satan and being led astray, and just this, it was this really vicious diatribe, and he just clicked like on the article, and I hadn't even noticed it, but I can't remember, I was chatting with a brother of mine who also left the Mormon church, and he was just like, just super upset, like, I can't believe that this just happened, that, our own father pushed it. Because my father is, he's a human being like any other human being, but generally speaking, he's a very gentle, very gracious man, that, he's just not someone you expect to launch, insults that way. And, so I was like, he probably just doesn't even realize that Facebook makes the fact that he clicked on that visible to everyone. That he knows. And,
you kind of find out what they really think about some stuff.
And so I messaged my father and was like, I don't think you realized that what you did there was a public action and we all saw it. And that you might, because I'm certain that you didn't intend to be in our faces about your opinions about us, but you were, because Facebook is designed to create these interactions,
right?
And he apologized. It was because and he's a human being who has his faults like anyone else.
Maybe through that you dialogue with him that maybe he's going to think about that.
Yeah, and I hope so, but I don't. There's this thing I read about online where if a social leader, like say if a football coach makes fun of a certain group of people and sets an example of bullying behavior towards any group of behavior, everyone on the football team will not even realize that they're acting negatively if they emulate the person who they look up to. And I think there's a element of that sometimes, where if you have a church leader who sets an example of dismissive or derogatory comments and behavior, that the people who look up to them as a leader won't even be able to recognize, unless it's pointed out to them, that they're doing something mean if they copy it. So it's I hope that my pointing it out was enough to get him thinking that maybe there's something wrong with that kind of language. But then again, if he's looking up to people who are modeling that behavior, he might not have the capacity to recognize it. Because anytime your social leader sets an example, if you're just like, oh yeah, he's the person who helps you figure out what's right and wrong in the world, you might not even be able to psychologically to notice when you're being mean by copying the behavior. So it's kind of a...
That kind of says a lot about current American culture.
That something like that is even likely to occur. And it's sad, and it makes, unfortunately, when I know that happens, it can make me on edge in situations where I hope not to be. There was a situation a couple of weeks ago where somebody walked up to me and they was like, "Oh, are you a member of the Church of Jesus Christ?" And I knew what they meant was that.
Of course, I'd say, of course I am.
Well, what they really meant was, are you Mormon?
Yeah, I know. Are you of Latter-day Saint?
Yeah, the Mormon Church has decided that it's too much of a mouthful even for them, so that's the way they shorten it. If they really can't even stand their own mouthful of a name, so I knew exactly what he meant, but so I wasn't going to say, "Oh yes, I'm Mormon." I didn't want to give that impression. But on the other hand, it's like, how do I answer? Because if I say no to the way he phrased it, it'll sound so strange, even in my own.
It's
mouth.
an odd predicament. I know. You kind of, I don't know.
So I just looked at him. I am a Christian, and he automatically knew that I meant that I wasn't Mormon because we both understood the subculture of the way he was using language.
Right.
But it was still that just moment of tension of, I don't want to respond aggressively because he's really just trying to make a casual comment, trying to ask whether or not we have shared background. And, but the phrasing of it, came across just so like, what it would mean for me to say no to that? Even though you're inviting me to say no if I'm not your brand, or that you're going to assume that I am your brand if I do say yes. It was just, and it's that history of comments that emotional trauma, that make that, instead of just a slight misunderstanding, that to a emotionally charged moment that it really shouldn't have been, but just trying to figure out how to navigate that with grace when someone is and they weren't even intending to be upsetting at all.
We've got someone who's visiting in Newer, and they just shared a part of their story, and he shared about the mission he went on is one of the closest experience, he said, of God, where it did change his life. And I heard this, and I said, well, of course, it sounds like it really did. I mean, he had his particular experience. And then he came to the realization afterwards, some things about himself that he knew wasn't in line with LDS Church. And when he shared that, he's under great pressure and really kind of being verbally abused by his family and the church. So he's kind of left. And, he kind of shared about coming here and said, and of course, I think this is what a wonderful thing, what it says about you all, the people of this congregation. He says, I've come here. He says, it was on a whim. I wasn't planned. Came here, and he said, it is the first time I have felt that strong of the presence of God as much as I did on my mission. And he said, it has startled me. And just it's a wonderful sharing and all this. And he talks about some of these things about the communication, where you come from and all that. So yeah, it's kind of hard. The last thing I thought about with the whole stoning of Stephen thing is, it's interesting, of course, the people who stoned Stephen, in their mind, they thought they didn't feel bad about this. They're like, this person is doing the wrong. It's the wrong thing. It's blasphemy. It's not acceptable, because that's what the religious stuff tells us. And so they take that into their own hands. And part of that is, I think, gets back to when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and all this about, say, you're so much about following the letter of law, you forget what God's intent is in these things. There was no relationship between Steve. There wasn't like, well, brother, why are you saying this? Or something. They didn't want to. Nobody wanted to listen to each other, and so they kill him, and they feel, I think, justified. But even in their feeling justified, he utters forgiveness. Now, of course, we're going to think about this. If I was in the place of Stephen, I'd probably be trying to pick up a rock and throw it back, or something. I mean, that would be my gut reaction. But, I'm sure when you're overwhelmed with that many people, he would have lasted long anyway. But I wonder if maybe my last words would have been, would I have uttered that? I don't know.
I would like to think I would, but would actually.
I think that's a lot of, as Christians, is we're really honest. We follow and we feel a strong conviction in being disciples of Jesus. And when we hear some of these things, you go, I hope I would have done that. But you never know. That's kind of.
How does it work from looking last week at Acts, where they went from, and Justin and I kind of spoke about this briefly, but they went from from hiding out in the upper room for fear of their lives, and then and it may just be literary, but then all of a sudden they're in the temple teaching, and nobody's getting exercised about that. But then Stephen, there seem to be a lot of disconnects here.
Yeah, and part of that is during the Easter season, if you notice, we don't have an Old Testament lesson. What we do is you get and year A, B, and C, you get different gospels' perspective on their understanding of the experiences of the resurrection. And you get that through the gospel during those 7 weeks, okay? And at the same time, what they do is in the book of Acts, because in the post-resurrection, they're beginning to come together as the earliest community after the resurrection, which now has changed. And it's not just the teacher. Things are changing. And so what they do is they have acts to say, well, hear what happened with that early church community. Because what you're kind of hearing the earliest descriptions of Christians and what happened. The one unfortunate with the one last week, though, is it kind of has them like trailblazing in. and the thing about this is that that's what happened, but it doesn't necessarily go with the thing of that Sunday, because really it's kind of a shame that would be a very good reading the Sunday after the Pentecost Sunday, because it's on Pentecost. Jesus keeps telling them like this. He said, prepare a place, you're going to do greater things. I have to go. But, and he talks about the Comforter, the Advocate, the Holy Spirit will come and lead you into all things. And so he's preparing them. And we get a glimpse of that today, and that, because that passage today from John is part of that farewell discourses that he goes to them. What happened with last week is after Pentecost and the Holy Spirit comes upon them, they get empowered to do this. So the very first thing is Peter, the guy who denied Jesus and wasn't always about, he's always rushing in saying crazy stuff before thinking about anything. Here he is, he gets empowered, and the men, they go out into the street. And there's a key thing here. There's that whole thing about the Spirit drove Jesus into the desert. There's a thing in the Greek there that has a similar thing. They pushed out into the streets and began proclaiming boldly. All of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, who are these people? But it's after the coming of the Holy Spirit. And then what we hear in Acts is some of the initial things. And one of them was they, instead of saying, I'm afraid still, they went into the temple and said, what you intended, so forth, so on, God is using to raise up a new thing. And of course they do get in trouble.
Yeah.
But that's a good question, because you're getting some of the story a little ahead of where we're going with the gospel.
Preview of coming attraction.
Yes, it is kind of really. On the John passage on the backside, I'll just read this and we'll go right into it. Before Christians were called Christians, they were known as followers of the way. The Acts of the Apostles is filled with references to those belonging to or knowing the way, as in Acts 9 and 18. Instead of God being a long way off, Jesus told his disciples that if you know him, you know God. Jesus is Emmanuel. God is with us. But he is also foreshadowing his death for his disciples and telling them that it is not the end. Jesus tells them that they know the way to the place he is going. Ever practical Thomas says, hang on a minute, Jesus, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? This is the same Thomas who would later say to his fellow disciples that he would not believe in the resurrected Jesus unless he saw and touched Jesus' wounds. It is notable that Jesus doesn't ignore Thomas. Jesus doesn't gloss over Thomas's question. Jesus doesn't appear to answer him condescendingly. He tells Thomas and all the disciples present, I am the way and the truth and the life. Jesus is connecting himself again to God by describing himself with a I am statement. Thomas asked hard questions of Jesus that perhaps the other disciples did not dare to, and in doing so, helped to crack open the word a bit more for all of us. I think that's a fairly decent little reflection this person did. And the first question is there, when have you had doubts or wanted to ask more questions of God? Well, we could spend, 10 hours on that one? I don't know if you maybe think of any examples you feel comfortable sharing, or.
Well, I always I'm feeling that tension of having deconstructed one way of thinking about religion entirely, and then trying to find a way to reconstruct faith. I can never quite have the same level of just assuming that something is true on its face, because I have all those skills that I built up of how to take things apart in my head.
Sure.
And having to, learning to read the New Testament and the Old Testament and being able to say, you can very easily find places where there's historical errors, where no, that didn't happen that way. I mean, we all know this. If because people use the Bible as their starting point of assumption for investigating the past frequently, and so when it doesn't match up, they were looking for it, because they were looking for proof, because they were assuming it was true, and trying to find the walls of Jericho having fallen down. The rubble's got to be in there somewhere, and things like that. And how do you live with the living God and say that there's certain times when the Bible is full of things where people were describing how they felt they were living with the living God and interpreting the past into their current understanding. And without good records, the chances that you're just wrong sometimes when you don't have the full story and you just project into the past your understanding of the present, and you just end up being wrong. And so I have to look with humility and say that my understanding of my faith is subject to the same weaknesses, and that it's not just, these people were wrong, they're all just making stuff up. I have to understand that me, with my own walk with God, tend to make stuff up too. That there's, and sometimes that's because I'm trying to create an internal narrative about a life that's much more messy than my ability to storytell. And sometimes it's because I'm projecting my understanding of the world into things that I don't know. And that to try to read the Bible with, humility is not quite the right word, but with empathy towards, that there's stuff in there that I know isn't true, and that, is very simple to actually prove that it isn't true. And there's, examples all over the place. Once you read texts of biblical scholars who actually bother mentioning it, then it's impossible not to see it. But, that these are people who are walking with God the best way they knew how, and telling the story of how they thought God interacted with them in their past and their present, and that sometimes they were wrong. Just like I can be wrong about whether or not someone that I know is, what's truly in their heart when I'm frustrated with them. I can be wrong about that. And if I try to write a story of my life with them and what I think God thinks of them, the chances that I would be wrong would be quite high. But that's the struggle that the writers of the Bible faced, and that there's to join in the story of people trying to live their life with God rather than trying to say that this is just the way it is.
Yeah, there's a lot of instances where, and we try to read 66 different books like it's one big novel, and it wasn't until really, when you look at history, very recent that we put chapters and verses. That's never, almost all these are meant to be read as a whole, instead of us saying, I'm going to take this one verse and just go off and say, we can sometimes I think it's almost, use a strong word, but idolatry, to say, I'm going to take the book of the scriptures, and it is holy, and it is inspired, because the truth is there. We get hung up on so many of the details of, always a bit like the whole creation thing. And it says a day. Well, our understanding is that's a 24-hour thing, and da-da-da. But in the ancient Hebrew text, when they're using day means a period of time. It's not trying to say God did it. Well, God could do anything God wants.
What does it mean for a day to be 24 hours before the creation of the sun is described?
Yeah, I know. So, there's part of this is we're bringing stuff that was never put in there, but we just presume. So, it's really, when you look at Orthodox Jewish scholars who get tickled at fundamentalist Christians, and they're going like, God didn't say he did it in 1 week. Do you take a weekend also? And I mean, they're going like, why do you feel so threatened by that? It says, we know that basically the whole creation narrative really rings true to what we see in the world. But does it matter if it was a day or a million years? Who cares?
It
God,
doesn't matter if it's
God,
an hour.
I know, because we're going like, God can do whatever God wanted.
And in
It's not
addition,
and the God is omnipresent and is beyond time, so it's irrelevant.
yeah, with God's omnipresence, you have to really say it doesn't matter whether or not, from a physical perspective, it looks like things just mechanistically happening. Because if God is omnipresent, then God is in all things.
Mm-hmm.
And to say that God created, what does it mean for God to be the creator if God is omnipresent in the matter that is created?
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to ask yourself that question: what does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
And to realize, maybe it doesn't really matter to me at all. I don't have to imagine God as the clockmaker. I can, I can.
That's a good statement.
I can say that it's okay for God to be present in the physical world, in all places, in all things, and that I can say that means that God is the creator of the world because God is in all things as they are coming into being and passing out of being.
And I think that's why and not just in Anglican, but especially in Anglican practice of spirituality, that the kind of Celtic spirituality has seen this explosion of people really drawn to it, because it's kind of that way. It's real earthy, and that, you can have the mountaintop experience, but sometimes that mountaintop experience may be, like when we sing St. Patrick's Mass, right, that I bind unto myself. Read that hymn sometime. But it says, where he starts talking about what speaks out, and he says, the old rocks speak out, and that looking at them, you can see the mighty power of God, and in creation even. It's kind of a thing, and it appeals to a lot of people because they can relate to it more. So there's a lot of things to that. But we all have our doubts and questions. I remember hearing, we just saw the coronation and everything. How many of you watched it? I'm just kidding. That's actually, I'm kind of surprised, because, us Episcopalians, but...
I was busy at a construction site.
Well, the thing about it is I recorded it, and yesterday I got the BBC America version because I knew they wouldn't talk over the service like the Americans will, and blah, 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 and they're doing blah, 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 because it's like, I want to hear Zadok the priest. I don't want to hear you talking during when they do that. So, but I've heard one Archbishop of Canterbury talking to a gathered group. He's being very vulnerable, and he said, people look to me as a leader and as a spiritual guide within the Anglican communion. And he said, great weight is upon that. And he said, but we were talking about the spiritual walks and stuff, and he talked about, as I do that, there's times where I ask this question, God, why this? And he goes, yes, the Archbishop does that, and he said, if you're not doing it, you probably should, and for Thomas, where Jesus kind of goes, and it is interesting because, when I had mentioned the sermon, they were known as the way. And Jesus talks about, I am the way, the truth, the life. And I think that's really great that, can you imagine today if we were all called the way? It seems odd, but it was interesting because it was a way of living. It was a way that was different from the world's. They were, these early Christians were pretty radical. Jesus was radical, what am I saying? So, well, and then the second one says, what does knowing Jesus as the way? This is a big one. What does knowing Jesus as the way mean to you? We don't ask that question a lot. And then how does that impact your life and your relationship with others? I don't know if any of you want to take a stab at that. I kind of thought that's pretty deep. What does knowing Jesus is the way mean to you? I think sometimes it's hard to answer that because you're trying to say, well, this is who I am. It's all of you. It's not just, well, it's this thing, it's this thing. But
I've always looked at it from the perspective of being called to respond with love and grace to the extent that I can when, no matter how people are interacting with me, that I have a calling to respond as much as possible with love and grace. That there's just that it fundamentally, yes, I do have to tend to my own emotional health as well, but that there's that Christ set this example and set up these values is something that I could understand, and that that's that was kind of very key part of my Christian development growing up was learning that that I had the ability to make those choices, and that not that it was easy, not that learning to be responsible for your emotions is hard, and it's hard for anyone, and everyone makes mistakes on that, but that there's a that if Christ is who I'm following, that there's that I have a duty to try to live that way.
But for me, I think there's two parts of this, because this is a big, and I think we're kind of quiet a little bit about this because this is like asking a big philosophical question, like, okay, run it in your mind in 2 seconds and answer, and it's kind of hard to do because this is a very deep thing of asking of your depth of you, but saying what does knowing Jesus as the way mean? For me, and not just as a priest, but just as me, it means for me that he is for me the way and the truth and life, and that if that is the case, the simple outward, now there's this deeper part about how I live into all of that. But part of it means that if he is the way and he's the light of the world, use all those kind of metaphors, it's something then for me that I want to be a part of. I want to try to live and emulate that. I want to follow his teachings and his example. And for me, ultimately, I'll use this phrase a lot sometimes, saying, what is it that is life-giving? And for me, knowing Christ is what is life-giving in this world. That there are other things that are life-giving, things. But for me, it's the one that keeps me centered. And even when I feel that maybe no one else around me feels the same way, there is the focus of, and unfortunately, what I've seen, what means for me that doesn't mean for some people say, well, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. They want to decide, well, they're not asking that question of themselves. It's all about, well, here's how I understand my faith. And if you don't do it the way I say, you're not following. So if you come to know God, but it's not through Jesus or Jesus the way I did it, then you're not in part of the way. I mean, because people sometimes will use this and say, well, the heathens in the jungles of New Guinea and la, 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 or what about people who follow Buddhism and stuff? And I'm like going, Jesus isn't saying that people who don't choose that are all evil and going to hell. He never says that. What you need to be counting on is, do we as Christians, it is the way, the truth, and the life. And I have to believe, if I believe all the other things that Jesus said, and also what he says about God, is, and people may disagree with this, but I'm going to make a big general statement that in some sense, there are some people who follow some religious things that I think, that some specific cults that have violence and all that. I mean, obviously, I can't see anything there that seems to be leading to God, I understand. But I see many of the ways of expressions that have grown around the world. I mean, so many things, for instance, in Buddhism, exactly is like it just, you start looking at it, because Buddhist people will say, I'm not a Buddhist, I follow Buddhist teaching, but it's not really their religion. They say there is, a holy other, whatever that is, but they have a way. And, and it's hard because they don't express things, other religions don't express things the same way as Christians. But it doesn't mean that we are the only corner of God's truth. I think God does reveal God's self to people. And, our hope is they will hear this really good news. And it is, it's not supposed to be this thing to go and whack people over it and kill them. It's about, okay, here, by the way, let me tell you about the way. We know. So there is that sense of evangelism. We share it, but we're never asked to say, well, what happens to them? We're never supposed to be the ones imposed upon. Because, I've got some people that I love dearly, but their whole focus is how the person will respond. Not the fact that we're called to be proclaimers and share it, but they're more worried about, are they going to go to hell or not? Mm-hmm. And they're preoccupied with an outcome that has been just drilled into them. And I'm going, I don't think God's intention is for you to say, well, you need to know Jesus, and here's how, and if you say this prayer, then you do. If you don't, you're going to hell. Jesus never approached people like that in the Gospels. Just never did. He just came and he blessed and he healed and all of that. And he didn't say, like, okay, now I want you to sign on the card here now. You're following me and you better, he never imposed judgment. So.
One time Bishop Hayashi was visiting here, and he proposed, there's nowhere in the scriptures that says that Jesus isn't allowed to work anonymously through other faith traditions. Saying, and when you see, and there's so many of the same principles of treating other people with love and respect that show up again and again in so many faith traditions. And if God is again omnipresent, then does it matter? Why should it matter to us if God works anonymously? Through other faiths, that's a if we see that that good is resulting, then we can all glorify God, just as we would hope that people would glorify God if they see us bringing good into the world.
And this, I know I don't want to focus too much on the coronation, but there was something, it was obviously, this whole service is very Christian, and very, Anglican Christian, in many ways, but something that was brand new in there that I thought was really, it was kind of a small symbolic thing, but for me it spoke a lot. So they invited these other representatives from all non-Christian faiths to come. And at the very end, they're there, they know full well this is a, big Christian service. So it's, and the thing about it is the Christians are also not trying to be apologetic and like, well, we don't want to offend you, but they're being who we are. They're saying what this is. But before he leaves, they meet him at the door of the church. You see that? And they're lined up, and he stops, and he looks them all in the eyes, and they together offer a prayer of blessing. And it was one part where he actually wasn't looking like a mechanical, but he goes, thank you. Like that, kind of gracious. And I said, no, that should be the Christian way we would react, instead of, what are you doing here, you heathen? Yeah, there's some good ways to be evangelists and not so good ways.
Did you download the service bulletin?
No.
They put out two versions. They put out just a regular service bulletin, and they put out one that explained what they were doing and why they were doing it. And I can't remember what it said particularly about that, but it was just nice write-up about why they invited these people and why they said what they did.
Yeah, and there's parts of it that like started kind of going fast, and I was kind of going like, wow, they're already done with that? Because usually you expect, oh, this is going to go on for 5 hours. And the only thing that's kind of odd is, and I know it would have been the logistical nightmare from hell to offer communion to everybody, but they did communion, and like what, 5, 6 people got it? That was it. I'm like, oh, that's just really kind of creepy a little bit.
That made for a long service.
Yeah, that would, I have to admit, that would have been.
And, unless you had distributed stations of priests offering it, but you'd have to have a ton of them and figuring out where everyone would walk.
I have to admit, when the Archbishop of Canterbury was doing the Eucharistic prayer, it's basically our Rite One prayer. I was sitting there before I knew it. I'm talking, and I'm by memory saying it with him. Yeah, one oblation and full satisfaction, da 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 da. Here we vouchsafe bless these thy the inestimable gifts, blah blah blah. And I was like, wow, that stuff just rolls off the tongues. But I never get those weird plates that they put up on the altar. They're gold plates. Platters, and they're up the face. And I'm going, it looks like something you'd see in your grandma's, thing in the dining room. Like, why you got plates up there? But yeah, they got their weird English things they do. So, and also somebody, I loved. There was an English priest. He was talking about it, and people started making comments, and I'm like, oh God, here we go. We're going to pick it apart. And someone said, what in the world did Charles bless the elements at the offertory to give it to him? And he says, somebody said, yeah, that was odd. Why was he touching and doing it? It's like, we're crossing church instead. I'm like, oh God, he's just doing it as a gesture of presenting them, But people get caught up in all that stuff.
I have to admit, after watching the coronation, I kind of opened my eyes a little bit, and you kind of see what do I want to say? The king in a different light, I guess, not just the leader or head of state of countries, but from more of a religious.
If you notice, really, this was every word in a lot of the stuff is Jesus and God and all this. And Colleen said, I must have said at least 5 times, Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And you are now called to model that. Well, I'm like, whoa, what does that actually say? And then through the anointing and everything of saying, okay, these are the vows you've taken. And then they repeated it. You're called to be a servant. With a lot of fancy gold stuff, but
The service bulletin explained about the anointing oil that he was anointed with, and it was actually, they went and got some olives from olive trees in Jerusalem, and they were processed, and they were blessed by the Anglican leader in Jerusalem.
oh yeah, the Archbishop, yeah.
And I explained how he brought it up to England. It was so interesting that it all started in Jerusalem and made its way to the Westminster Abbey.
I also, I don't know, sorry, we're going to go, we'll end this, but just one of the things that was so different than any that's ever been, it had the ancient rites, that really tie into the ancient traditions, but embraced a lot of new things, like that. The gospel choir just blew me away, that Alleluia they sang. And I actually started, it's like the bishops actually started to smile for once. So I did have to admit they were all very stoned. It's like, did someone all give them Xanax or Valium before this? Because they're even Charles was like, he kind of looked like, what's going on? What's going on? It's like, I've been waiting 70 years for this.
One picture I saw, I wasn't, I was reading it on online, and it was just a review of the coronation. The one picture I saw, he looks just like his mother. I mean,
Oh, he did.
Yeah, it's just.
I was looking at his face and said, oh, is he getting older now? He really is. Yeah, and then when he had that crown on, I had that,
Yeah, with the hair.
there was kind of a connection. But I liked that, like, this was the very first time that women bishops were included in a service. And one was a bishop of color, that was a woman, and there was just a lot of diversity of people embraced and included, which was, I mean, for the Church of England, that's a pretty big step.
ACNA probably was having connections.
Who?
The ACNA was probably.
Oh,
having
yeah,
connections.
oh, God.
It'll be interesting to see what William does. He tends to